Okay, so McCoy Creek is in northeastern Oregon. And I have this map in there just for folks who maybe aren't familiar with the Pacific Northwest. But if we kind of zoom in close to La Grande, it's out there, and I'm not going to use my pointer here, but kind of in that general area of the Blue Mountains. So if we zoom in even further, this is the Grande Ronde Basin, and it's in the upper Grande Ronde watershed. And the reason this is important, 20 years ago, we were doing a lot of work, small projects, culvert replacements, bank stabilization, that type of work. And I would say about 20 to 30 years ago, we really started moving into big, large-scale restoration, directly in response to the listing of salmon in the Pacific Northwest, listed under the Endangered Species Act. So in response to that, I was working for the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, and they work directly with landowners. They tend to do a lot of property protection and figuring out ways to run kind of a cattle ranch or do farming, but also kind of protect river systems. So that was my role, was working as a geomorphologist with landowners, trying to figure out how to kind of help them better manage their land for conservation of our species, but also so they could run a profitable kind of operation. So there we are in the upper basin. This is McCoy Creek back in about 1939. So you can see that nice kind of meandering channel. Now, if you look closely, in 1939, even though a lot of our earliest aerial photos go back to that time, it was not a good time for conservation. It was not good land use practices. Think like, the Dust Bowl. There was a lot of overgrazing. So this site had already been overgrazed. It had already been somewhat straightened, but there was still this kind of meandering stream out there in this big, wide valley. Through time, up until about 1960, they started channelizing McCoy Creek. Now, this happened to small to moderate-sized streams all over the country, all over the world. I would argue that most kind of small and medium-sized streams that we see have been manipulated to some extent, some of them dramatically. And certainly McCoy Creek was straightened from the top end to the bottom. This is about 2 miles of the creek. And this is what it looked like in about 1980. Hadn't changed, really. So it was put in this trench, and it didn't move. And there was this big kind of potential wetland surrounding it. It was McCoy Meadows. So it was a wet meadow in the past. We had this really unique opportunity working with a single landowner who owned all the land in the bottom of the valley, which is very unusual, and who didn't want to use it for grazing cattle. He essentially wanted to turn it in kind of his own small, like, wildlife refuge. So biggest project I had ever worked on, single property, a couple thousand acres, and we got to essentially re-meander the channel. Hence why I called this talk kind of first generation meander reconstruction. When we started this work 30 years ago, that's what we were doing, reconstructing single thread meandering channels. So we went out here and came up with these kind of restoration objectives. We wanted water at or near the surface throughout the early part of the growing season. We had these kind of specific things we were going for. We want hydrophytic vegetation. We essentially wanted all the things that constitute a wetland. But we also wanted to convey water and sediment at rates to ensure a long-term balance of erosion and deposition. This is really critical. This is where we are at with our understanding of rivers, and how we approach river restoration was everything was transporting through, and we always thought about these transport channels. I'm going to come back to this at the end, kind of toward the end of the talk, but this is a really critical piece. And finally, the lateral and vertical adjustment, that just means the erosion, bank erosion and bed erosion, were kind of at rates observed within similar streams. So we wanted the stream to continue to move around. We had the opportunity to let it be dynamic. And at the time, probably one of the biggest restoration projects in the country. So it's a little daunting. I'm kind of starting out my career here saying, yeah, we can totally take this on. So we started with the upper part. Now keep an eye on that road that crosses the valley. It's just a really good marker so you know where you're at. Now the upper part, if you look kind of carefully, you'll see that the old channel was still there. They didn't get around to filling it in. But great, okay, we're gonna push the water back into this old channel and just reactivate it. And that was fantastic. And it was exciting for me because I got to design an engineered log jam like back in the late 90s, but this is like the big thing. We had the International Conference on Wood and World Rivers in Corvallis. Like wood, the idea of wood in rivers was like a big deal. And now it's just like standard like practice. It's just something we always do. But back then we didn't. So I got to design this engineered log jam. And if you look at that picture up on the top, basically blocked the water, shunted the water back into the old channel. And so that yellow blob, that's essentially where the engineered log jam is sitting. So we take a look at that, and this is zoomed into that upper part above the road. This is what it looked like as it evolved after we put in that engineered log jam. And it was amazing. And just for Jim, I will tell you, this is where I started thinking about the stream evolution triangle and the importance of biology, because the biology came in here with the vegetation and it recovered so quickly. We're like, whoa, we did not expect that, not that rapidly. But we saw this tremendous response in the upper part. Like, this is great. And we were claiming success, but then we had to look at the lower part. This was a lot harder because the old channel had been obliterated. We had a picture of it, but there really was no remnant out there. So how do you reconnect that? Like, what do you do? What template do you use? And there were all kinds of guidance documents at the time about the size of the stream and the exact cross-section and how meandering, and we used all this geometry and all these things that I think we've come to find out were really probably unnecessary. And if we look at this part of McCoy Creek and how it evolved through time, you could see that upper piece looking pretty good after we did the first part of the project. And the decision we had to make in that lower section, I'm just going to call it that lower McCoy Creek, when we think about the channel evolution model, and this is an old model from 1984, and it was really this idea of channels that kind of, when they in size, they deepen and they widen. And we often would call them like these down and out streams, right? They cut down and they widened, and they would just get stuck there. And that's where McCoy Creek was. And what we really needed to decide is which direction to move it for restoration. So your choices are, okay, we're sitting at stage 3. We've got the stream that's widening out, it's eroding its banks. And do we want to go up and take it back up and connect it with the floodplain? Or do we take it down and essentially excavate a new floodplain? So this is the decision you're faced with. And we're like, well, there aren't any roads out there. There are no structures. We're like, we're taking it back up. We're going to fill in that channel and we're going to pop this thing back up and we're going to reconnect it to the floodplain. And so that's the decision that was made. It's come over several years and lots of meetings with landowners and so forth. And so that's the direction that we headed. So some of the things that we were looking at, the variables, and some of this may mean more to some than others, but we chose a discharge, 270 CFS. That's how much water we needed to put down this channel. And I didn't bring my rock with me, but essentially at the time, the way we designed these projects was based on the size of a rock. We needed to transport certain size sediment. The recurrence interval of this flow was about a 1.25-year event, so fairly small. With a 10-year flow of 810, that should inundate that entire floodplain. So at this channel forming flow, I mean, this was so critical. When we did this design work, we had to, I mean, just think about this. I've got a river that's in a ditch. All right, now you're going to move it up on the floodplain. How big is it? What does it look like? You're going to send a bulldozer out there to dig a channel, and you have to decide exactly what it looks like. And it's intimidating because it's a lot of work, it's a lot of money. And we had a team of folks, but we essentially kind of had to choose this discharge. So what we ended up doing with this 270 CFS, it moved a certain size particle, and I'm going to get to that in a moment. But it ended up being about 22 feet wide, about 2.3 feet deep, and our velocities kind of at that discharge were kind of a maximum of about 4.6 feet per second. And the particle that we transported, so we were looking at this kind of 1-inch particle. And this ends up being pretty important a little bit later in the story. And don't worry, most of the rest of the talk is pictures. Because Jim's like, wow, I've never seen you put so many numbers in a presentation. Because they're usually all pictures. So we'll get there. At the time, this kind of first generation meander reconstruction, we essentially said, okay, we've got a particle that is 1 inch or 1.5 inches in diameter. we have to move this thing from the top of the valley all the way through to the bottom. I need the depth of water. I need the velocity to transport that through. And that drives your entire design. It's one particle. And which size do you choose? Well, what we did is we went out in the field and we collected some data in the existing channel and a side channel material coming in, and we plotted it out. And what we found is that the average particle size, so 50% was larger, 50% was smaller, fell in right there at that 26 millimeters or about an inch. And what this comes down to is this Lane's balance, right, from 1954, actually was, I keep looking at Jim because he knows all this stuff. I know he's going to call me out if I kind of get one of my references wrong. Never. So you will hear people say Lane 1955, it might even say this on here, but actually the original paper was 1954, because I just found it pretty interesting. There wasn't a diagram, but it was this idea, this very simple idea, that the amount of discharge, so the amount of water, right, times the slope is in a proportional relationship with the amount of sediment that's being moved and the average particle size. And so what you had to do is balance to make sure that you didn't get incision or aggradation. So it was this whole balancing act that you have to match. And so you wanted to stay within this red box. That's your goal. Your design goal is stay within that box. And so you spend a lot of time figuring out the discharge, the slope of the channel, and the size of sediment that you're moving. So coming back, our performance criteria for this project was that we were going to convey water and sediment at rates to ensure that this long-term balance, so what I mentioned before. And this kind of drove much of our design. And specifically, we wanted to transport the D84. So if you work in restoration, you'll often hear people throw around terms like, oh, the D50. 50% of the particles are larger, 50% are smaller. The D84, 84% are smaller, and 16% are larger. And where does D84 come from? I thought it was some magical number. Like, oh, there must be some really good reason why they use it. It's really specific. And it didn't occur to me at the time, but I was talking to a few other folks who've been around a lot longer than me. I'm like, oh yeah, it's because D50, the channel started filling up, so they just went up one standard deviation to a D84. That's all it is. It's one standard deviation above a D50. So this is what's dry. I know, I had the same reaction. It's like, really? That's it? I wanted more. So that's what drove our design. So now when we come back, we look at that D50, and then we look at the D84. Now we're looking at more like 1.5 inches diameter. So somewhere, you know, about yay big. That's what we're moving through the channel. Like, well, that's all really good, but what does that look like? Well, then you have to figure out what this channel is going to look like and how squiggly it's going to be and where you put the turns in and how tight they are. And there isn't a lot of great guidance for this. So we're looking at like the old path of the channel and we're trying to figure out what it looks like. This is what we came up with. We didn't want it to look like this perfect kind of Disneyland stream. We want it to look, you know, a little bit more natural. So that was the proposed channel. Those big black blobs, those are, we called them blended terraces, I believe, but essentially blocking off the ditch. And they were very low, but it was to spread water out on the floodplain so the water wouldn't get back into that old channel. So it seemed like a pretty good idea. And we wanted diversity on the bed, right? So we wanted some riffles and we wanted some deeper pools and we wanted variability in the bed. So this is kind of what we came up with. And then when you hand this package over the contractor, who's going to go out there with the equipment, we actually color-coded things out in the field so they would go out and dig the pools where they're supposed to go and the riffles. I mean, so this is all quite complicated stuff, but we got it all laid out. It seemed like it was going well. We had our cross sections. I won't bore you with all the other details, but there was this design report that was a couple hundred pages long. So here we are. We've done all this great work. We've had this huge team in there working on this for a year or two, and we're getting ready to go to construction. This is what McCoy Creek looked like before the project. This is a 5-year flood event in McCoy. Didn't access floodplain. We're doing a wet meadow project. It's being paid for by the Wetland Reserve Program with NRCS. Keyword being wetland. We needed to make the land wet. So it was staying in the channel during a 5-year flood event, and this is what it looked like during low flow. So pretty incised, the floodplain's not connected at all. So we start blocking the channel. We put in some structures. We're trying to catch some sediment the first couple of years, and then we're essentially going to dam those off. Then we moved to 2000. I always want to say 2020. We moved to 2000, and we start construction. And this is where things kind of get a little scary. Like, okay, we've done all this work. Now they're going out there with bulldozers, and they're digging this channel. And this is what it looks like. You're building it in the dry season. There's no water out there. And we're digging around. We find some gravel. Like, okay, this is good. This is reassuring. We have our dimensions, and we're out there, and folks are actually checking to make sure that the depths are correct and the widths are correct. If you look carefully, you can see there's wood in that corner. So there was a lot of large wood kind of incorporated in this project. And this is what it looked like during low flow, because we didn't turn the water into it right away, because we were really scared. We were flat out scared. Like, we're going to grow some vegetation. So we got sprinklers out there. We irrigated the plantings for a couple years until the neighbor turned in the other landowner for a water rights violation. And they said, yes, you have a water right, but it is not for irrigating plantings. Water got shut off and all the vegetation died. So this is just like the world of restoration. You're like, oh, you're gonna be kidding me, all this work. And so we ended up saying, well, we need to turn the water in. And I will tell you, we don't really do that anymore, but back in the day, we irrigated all the plantings. And you imagine this huge kind of irrigation program. So in 2002, a couple years later, we decided we're going to introduce the flow, and we do it very slowly. And here's the top end. So that's where the log jam was installed, shunting the water kind of through that upper section. And then we basically start introducing the water. We've got a gauge out there to make sure, see how much water is flowing through. And this is the water just starting to fill the channel. And this is all looking great. We're like, okay, whew, we're good. And we're feeling pretty good until, you know, we get to a first big flood. So this is low flow. You can see this channel is just starting to wet up. And then in 2003, we have the first big flood. And my other folks working on this team with me, the engineers, were really sweating it, right? So they're trying to figure out what's going to happen during this big flood. Well, it's looking pretty good. So we're out there, everyone's in the field, we're taking pictures, we're looking at what's going on. We're like, all right, it looks like the channel's holding together. Because the other really different thing about this project, it didn't have any grade control in it. And at the time, I won't go into huge debate. Some of you may be familiar with kind of the Rosgan approach for restoration. It involved a lot of rock. We sent this out for an external review, and the person who reviewed it came back and said, this is great, but you need 17 drop structures of rock. We're like, no, we want this to be a natural channel. This is valley bottom. It's not full of rock. So we chose not to put in grade control. And that was also very controversial at the time. So we're looking at it, seeing like, okay, it's looking good, holding together. But every time you see a little bit of white water, take a look at that. That's where the water's speeding up. It's more turbulent, and potentially there's some head cuts there. So there's erosion of the stream bed going on. So first, like, okay, we got to that first one. And then comes 2004. We're going out there a lot on this project. So now we've got some aerials. It's super cool. So we're essentially, on the bottom of the slide, we are at the upper end of the valley, kind of looking down valley. So you can see where the old channel's been ponded off. So we used to call this plug and pond. So we plugged off the channel, we ponded that water, shunted the rest of it back, into this new channel. Like, all right, it's looking pretty good. So you can see the ponds, but I want you to look a little more closely as we kind of zoom in. So there's some areas, like we've got some nice flow on the floodplains. Again, we're kind of patting ourselves on the back, like, yeah, it's looking really good. But if you look carefully at these photos, you're going to see some white spots that kind of pop out. There's probably one of the more obvious ones there right in the middle of the screen, and that's a head cut. And now we're starting to sweat, like, oh no, what did we do? What's going on here? How do we repair this? Some people at this point called this project an incredible failure. Other people said it was amazing, it was a great success. There was no agreement on whether this was a success or a failure. I think it was a fantastic experiment and continues to be a fantastic experiment. because we're able to go out there and continually kind of manipulate the system and measure and monitor, an opportunity that we just don't get very often. So here we are at the bridge. You can see there's some white water there, and even downstream, we're seeing a little bit of a head cut starting to form. So there's just a kind of a zoomed in shot. These are the areas that are causing us some grief. Now, as you imagine, as we work on this project, well, by 2005, I'd left the NRCS. I'd gone to work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The design engineer had left his position in Idaho and moved to Alaska. So none of us are left. We've got a new engineer. We've got a new team of people. And they're like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? This thing's falling apart. So, and typically during that time, we would go out and do the review. So here's the past engineer, the new engineer who showed up, and we're out there and we're just looking at the site, what's going on. Our goal was to stop people from mucking around, like changing it. Let's see what happens. Let's see how it evolves. But they were quite nervous. So we went out and did a field tour in 2004, and this is what it looked like in the upper part. It's amazing, it's beautiful. We're like, well, we're feeling pretty good, but we're going to just kind of walk downstream and you can see some of the things that are happening. So if you notice the vegetation, the color of the vegetation is different close to the stream than up in that kind of floodplain area. It's not very well connected. You can see a little bit of bank erosion going on. But I think, for most people say, yeah, that's looking pretty good. There's some erosion of the bed in this picture. And yes, they did go in and put in rock structures. They just couldn't help themselves. Like, it might move, it might do something, let's go lock it in place. Because at the time there was this real debate about should a stream move around and adjust. And a lot of people were really uncomfortable with streams moving around. Because I think, I don't know, the community of practice, we don't trust streams very much. We think they might just go off and do wild things all on their own. So they went and they put in a lot of rock structures. And these were not designed well. They didn't include them like in the initial design. So this was like it's kind of like an aftermarket product, right? It doesn't really fit that well. So we're looking at these structures, and we can certainly understand why they did this, but it just wasn't, I think, done thoughtfully enough. I guess you can always say that when you've walked away from a project. But these structures were pretty coarse. They really weren't kind of holding the channel together. But the bigger question that we had as a design team is, why is this channel falling apart? Like, what's wrong? The guidance at the time was to build channels for a 1.5-year flow event, even a bigger channel than we had. But this channel, it still wasn't accessing the floodplain. Like, what did we get wrong here? And you can see a really kind of a significant head cut forming at this location as we're kind of working our way down the valley. And you can see that sediment coming out, so it's being eroded from the upper part of the valley, being transported to the lower part of the valley and depositing out. And then as we get toward the bottom end, it was great. There was a big beaver complex down there, and they were kind of holding everything up. So on the bottom end, we had this really wonderful connected floodplain wetland system with the beaver complex. So there we are at the bottom end. So now we move to 2008. So let's see, 4 years later, how's it doing? Well, in 2008, we'd moved like from single thread channel reconstruction, and then the thing became side channels. We need side channels. We were building side channels all over the place because we decided that's where the fish really wanted to go. Now, no one really talked to the fish, but we thought this was really important that we have all of these side channels. So a new engineer comes on, and she looks at the project, she's like, yeah, those rock structures don't look great. We're going to build some side channels into this thing. And so that's her role. So it's almost like with each new engineer, they got to add the next thing to it. The restoration practice that was kind of popular at the time. And this was just a great place to try it out. So here we are at kind of another high flow in McCoy Creek. And you can see it's still not really connected with its floodplain. But it's close. So once we see those flows, we're working with Megan as a new engineer, and it took a few years to kind of get the side channel stuff in. And here's what it looks like. So here we're at the upper end. At the entrance to each of these side channels, because we're so concerned that is going to capture too much flow, we kind of put a bunch of logs and rocks so we don't capture too much of the flow. So if any of you have worked on a project, a design project, and you think about the design challenges of the amount of flow and your discharge, your sediment transport, bank erosion, bed erosion, and then you say, oh, can I have 3 channels instead of 1? Like, no, you cannot, because it's too complicated. Modeling that is incredibly difficult. And we really didn't have the computational capacity to handle that type of complexity. And I think that's often why we end up with these single channels, because at least we can sort of understand what's going on. But we start splitting off flow and sediments going all over the place, it's really difficult to predict what will happen. But my question is, well, why does it matter? It's in the bottom of the valley. There are no houses, and they're not using it for agriculture purposes. Like, can't we just let the stream go? And at the time, no. The answer was no. We just didn't do that. So this is this next phase, and you'll see some of these side channels kind of popping up as they're constructed. And essentially, they're just going from the channel. They're trying to get water on the floodplain, and to do this, they're just digging these kind of ditches to bleed water off into the floodplain. So this is kind of what they look like. Like, I don't know, not looking all that natural to me. And this is actually, if you look over on the left, that's where the engineered logjam is. And the logjam, I will say, held up pretty darn well. That was really fun to kind of go through the design process, but you know, every year we went out there, that thing held up quite well. The existing channel that we'd filled in didn't capture any of the flow, but we weren't really meeting the goals, the objectives of the project. And I think that was the big disappointment. And one of the reasons, so, you know, we're always looking for some other reason besides, well, we did the design was inappropriate. We saw a whole bunch of trampling out there. Cattle grazing was removed decades ago. So it wasn't the cattle. Like, what's going on? Well, there were a lot of elk. There continue to be a lot of elk out there. And we have a lot of elk, and what we don't have are wolves. But I will tell you, when I was out there, I can't remember what year it was. It must have been about 2010. So I'm out in that area with the biologist, fortunately, in the car with me. And we're driving along the road, and we're going down. Like, wow, that's a coyote in the road. Like, that is a really, really big coyote. And we get up to it, and it's a wolf. And this thing literally is like this high. It was unbelievable. And the biologist said, yeah, that's absolutely a wolf. It was before they had any wolves in that area. Like, not saying anything. We're just not going to mention it because it's such a political hot potato. I think, I mean, it still is a challenge. We're still kind of dealing with the issues with wolves and with cattle and so forth. But because there weren't predators in the area and the landowner loved his elk, they just ate everything in sight. They ate all of our plantings. So grazers are grazers, right? It can be cattle, it can be elk, but they can have the same effect if they don't have kind of a natural predator in the area. And we went out and did a study looking at this by having these exclosures around the plantings that we put in where the elk couldn't get in. And they ate everything around it. And the willows only got to be about 3 or 4 inches tall. That was it. They never got taller than that. It was such a stress in the system, it pushed the beaver out. The beaver couldn't survive. So they just didn't have anything to eat. So they left. So now we lost the beaver complex in the lower end as well. So this is not looking good. So we've got all these projects. So we start with the meander reconstruction, the single channel. Then we go in and we put in some rock structures and some additional wood. 4 or 5 years later, we go in and we put in side channels to spread the flow. Like, so what are we going to do next? We still are not meeting the objectives of the project. So remember, this is a wetland. Now I've forgotten what the acronym was. Enhancement program. No, it's Wetland Reserve Program. There we go. WRP. I always think WRP in Cincinnati for those of you who are older in the audience. Wetland Reserve Program. It's still not a wetland. And that was what really bothered me. Like, the stream's a lot longer, more complex, deeper pools, better habitat, better spawning. We've got like Chinook up here. lots of good things are happening. And I think 70% successful, but that part about, but it's not a wetland. And this is something I really want you guys to think about, because this is I'm actually going to West Virginia next week to meet the Corps of Engineers to talk about stream mitigation and floodplains, and this understanding that floodplains are wetlands. They're floodplains, they're wetlands. I'm not sure why we're having so much trouble kind of merging these two ideas, these concepts, but to me, a floodplain should be a wetland. And certainly in this circumstance, it would be a wetland if it were connected. So let's go back to our objectives. Right, so these are the objectives that we started with, but the one that I really want to focus on is number 3, that conveying water and sediment at rates to ensure a long-term balance of erosion and deposition. But I'll ask you about a floodplain. How are floodplains built? Why are they there? It's a depositional environment. If we didn't have any deposition, we wouldn't have floodplain. So I really started questioning the whole concept of what we were doing, kind of getting back to Lane's balance. Like, well, should we be designing it as a transport channel? Aren't we just moving everything through? And so this is probably for the last decade or so has been the thing that's, I guess I've been really struggling with and trying to get this idea out there and start the conversations and try to move away from this idea that everything has to be a transport channel. Because if we introduce biology and more complexity, you start seeing aggradation or accretion on the floodplain. These tend to be the hotspots biologically. If things are just moving through, I mean, it's important for the transport of water and sediment and organics and species are moving through. But as far as habitat complexity, thinking of fish spawning, rearing, primary productivity, it's happening in these depositional kind of hotspots. So let's take a look at where McCoy Creek was, or I guess is actually at the moment. And this is just kind of a time lapse starting back when it was straightened and just really using Google Earth to see how it's transitioning through time. So you can see that first project come in, the single thread meandering channel. You're going to see some side channels pop up here in a second. So there the side channels come in. But the thing that still strikes me as we look at this, is it still really dry? And particularly in arid areas, these valley bottoms where we would have beaver complexes, they would be like emeralds. It would be an oasis in the desert. This is where a lot of species would come. And we hadn't achieved that. So a lot of partners working on this project, kind of keeping an eye on time here. A lot of folks working on this project, Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation have been very involved along with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. The Confederated Tribes are quite involved now of taking this project to the next level. Again, some people would say, well, this is a failure. And I would say, well, I'd say it was a 75% success. Can we have that? But how do we get that last bit? How do we get that floodplain connectivity? And that's really kind of where we're headed with this. So in 2013, Brian Kluwer and Colin Thorne came out with the stream evolution model. This is an update to that earlier model I showed you, the channel evolution model. They've moved it to the stream evolution model, thinking more broadly. So Colin really brought in the part of adding these additional stages and kind of putting this in a circle, which is great. And if you have an interest, you can certainly look this up and read it. And if you hear the term stage 0, it comes from this paper. So I would encourage you, instead of listening to what everybody else says about it, kind of read it, kind of figure out what that actually means. But essentially, right up there on top, that's the stage 0. You'll hear that a lot in restoration right now. And then the part that Brian Kluwer really brought into this, and they're both geomorphologists, but Brian works for No Fisheries, and was really looking at the habitat capacity for these different kind of stages on the stream evolution model. And if you look up at the top, we get the most kind of habitat benefits and attributes at this stage 0 condition, which is essentially the undisturbed kind of pre-settlement condition. So the idea then was, we've had a lot of these projects that have evolved over time, and we've been doing these floodplain reconnections. So this is the next stage for McCoy Creek, is they're going to go back into it. And hang on, there we go. They're going to go back in, and this time do a full floodplain reconnection. And this is where things get quite controversial, because remember when we started this kind of conversation, I said, well, it was 270 CFS. That was our design discharge. But when you're doing this approach of reconnecting, why do we dictate the size of the channel? Like, what did the channels do before we were here to like go out with bulldozers and build them for the stream? Because certainly there were events, landslides, debris flows that would completely fill these valley bottoms. And then the channel kind of etched itself in, it evolved, meandered, and it created whatever kind of dynamic system, and it would just continue to adjust. So in a lot of these projects now, they're abandoning these ditches and maybe making some flow paths, but really allowing the stream to evolve on its own. Because I think the thought now is allowing the stream more latitude to evolve, as opposed to forcing a size, a plan form, a specific location on that particular stream system. So here we are in 2024, and I'm hoping to stay involved with this project. I'd love to see this next phase and what they do. But you can see kind of in the 30s and where we were, basically in about 2012, and where are we headed from here. So if you look at this kind of elevation model, you can see the pink, that's the ditch, right? So that's the ditch channel, and all the blue would be areas that are reconnected. And that's what we really tried to do. But if we look, kind of zoom in on McCoy Creek, you can see these areas and where we have the opportunity to reconnect the floodplain. And it really is that kind of that gray area, which is just a little bit lower. So ideally, once this thing is reconnected, everything that you see in blue and gray is going to be wet most of the time. If it's in the light greens, that's going to be on a fairly regular event. So this might be a 1 year or even more frequent than that we're going to see this entire kind of valley bottom inundated. And this is just an idea of what that might look like. And the really cool thing, a couple things in my career that I think significantly have changed the way we've done our work is LIDAR. LIDAR has fundamentally changed the field of river restoration. And I would say fundamentally changed geomorphology, because we can see so much more detail. I hate to admit this, but it was only a year or two ago, I was listening to a talk by Ellen Wohl in a course that she was kind of giving a guest lecture in on her Forgotten Legacies paper. Really great paper, I think it was from 2019, talking about all these kind of things in the landscape that we may not even see that really influence what our streams look like. And I remember surveying McCoy Creek and the valley way back in the late 90s, and we had this kind of break, we call it a break in slope. We're like, well, it comes down, there's this break in slope, and that's where we saw these head cuts. And I'm like, oh my, they were old beaver dams. They were beaver dams that went across the entire valley bottom, and we didn't recognize them. Because, I mean, they're subtle, but they were really important for holding the system together. So what we're lacking in McCoy Creek are beaver. We have a lot of elk, and we didn't have any wolves. So there was an imbalance in the ecology, which really affected the geomorphology. And as a geomorphologist, I'm kind of entering this from the other angle, right? I'm like, wait, I'm going to think about the geomorphology, and the ecology is kind of the output. But I think got that wrong. And it was kind of a wake-up call for me. But it's surprising, like looking back, what you can miss. And LIDAR, it has really just kind of opened the door for us to see so much more detail. The resolution is just so much greater. And now that we've got kind of this 2D modeling and we can do all these kind of perspectives, this is incredibly powerful with the public. Because you might have this idea in your head, but if you show them a picture like, this is what we think it's going to look like, oh, okay. or they're like, no, don't do it. What I want to share with you is a project that some of you may be familiar with. This is White's Creek out near Sisters, Oregon. So this is another site where we've been working on a project year after year, different reaches, doing kind of this full valley bottom reconnection. So White's Creek was put into this ditch along the side of the valley. It got stuck there for decades, and we were trying to reconnect it. And so essentially they abandoned that ditch, they spread the flow over the valley bottom, and they allowed it to evolve kind of on its own. And this is what it looks like. So there's the initial channel just for reference. And if we'll just kind of look at it as it evolves through time, and they lowered some areas to allow the flows to get out, and you'll see that there are multiple channels, and they kind of change positions over time. And this project is still evolving, and there's been a ton of research out here. So diatoms, macroinvertebrates, fish populations, vegetation, nutrients, I mean, you name it, they've been measuring it out here to see what the response is. And it's this kind of idea from McCoy Creek, because as the field of river restoration has evolved over the last 30 years, like at least in my experience, because we have a lot of projects on the ground, I think we're willing to take more risks. And now that we've got these projects in a lot of different places, like, okay, we can learn from that and we can apply it to other places. Well, we've also seen our projects that were 100 feet long, 200 feet, and now we have projects that are thousands of acres and 10 miles. So we're working at the reach scale. And I think why that's really important is because if you've got kind of watershed-wide issues that you're trying to address, going in and fixing things at that 100-foot scale really isn't going to make the impact that we're looking for. So our projects have gotten much, much larger. So if you're interested, you can go to this information hub. There's all the papers and so forth I referenced are there. This project is in there, plus many others. And that's kind of where we're at right now, is this full floodplain reconnection and this idea of multiple channels. So we really, in restoration, we kind of started off with like habitat projects where we put in like a few logs, or we tried to create cover for fish. And then we started working a bit more at the reach scale. And then I would say 80s, 90s, we started moving into this kind of meander reconstruction, like building channels. From there, we added side channels. We added a lot more large wood. And now we're kind of stepping forward into this, really thinking about streams in 3 and 4 dimensions instead of just 1 dimension. But it didn't happen overnight. Like each step has been a real struggle. Large wood, beaver used to be incredibly controversial. And while there still is some controversy around it, it's really settled down. And now it's like, oh, this full floodplain thing, I don't know. It's kind of scary. And now we're doing more of this work. So I think as researchers and scientists, it's fascinating because it's a rapidly evolving field. And there are new things going on, and there's so many different aspects. I mean, we don't really understand the social aspects of this work very well. We don't really monitor birds. We started doing that, and we're seeing the bird kind of response is amazing. All kinds of opportunities for research. I think that's what I find, it's so exciting. So I want to leave you with some lessons learned, and then we can have a discussion. The first one for me is that we don't need to transport all the sediment in these depositional environments. Like, who said that you had to take a particle from the top of the watershed and deliver it to the ocean, right? It stops along the way in alluvial fans, in floodplains, in debris flow deposits. So there's this residence time. Things don't have to always just move through. So I like this idea of kind of imbalance because that's really important. We need to include biology right up front, right up there with the hydrology and the sediment transport. It is equally as important, and in some places like McCoy Creek, it is probably more important. I've probably reviewed, I couldn't tell you, thousands of projects in my previous position. Like every project, like in the state of Idaho too, Oregon would kind of come across my desk. And I would say 90 5+% of those projects, I said, your channel is too big. Your channel is too big. The water's not going to get on the floodplain. And you know what? The floodplains, that's the fish get out there and they feed and grow. That's where we get our food. That's where fish get their food. That's where all kinds of animals get their food. It's a very productive area. In stream, if we keep everything in the channel, it's not very productive. So if we're wanting to feed aquatic organisms, we really need that connectivity. Okay, I didn't mention too much about this, but one of the things we learned with transporting this particle is we sampled in the old channel. Well, it was already oversized. We sampled it where the sediment was coming out of the canyon. That was too big. We chose a size that was too big. We transported too much sediment. That was one of the big problems. Our channel was too big. We were transporting too much sediment because we were scared that we were going to fill that channel up. I don't know why we were so afraid of that. It's just how we were trained. Detailed, reliable topography. Now we have LiDAR. It is so much better because looking back at some of these old projects, I mentioned the beaver dams. We didn't even see that. And that was certainly a big issue in our design. One of the other things we learned that I didn't talk about is if you're going to design a single thread channel, like we etched out this channel, but we didn't put anything into it. So if you think about sediment coming down, there was nothing in the middle and it took a long time for that channel to fill up with sediment. So we kind of starved the reach downstream. And then finally, the thing I really learned from this project is that you really have to set your own success criteria, because we had hundreds of people have come out to this project, and some people say, well, it's complete failure. Some people say, no, it was success. I'm like, but how do you know? If you say, these are our success criteria, these are our performance criteria, did we meet them? But don't let other people judge your work, because they're going to come in a decade or 2 decades later and say, you failed. I'm like, I didn't have LiDAR. I didn't have all the tools you have today. So this is a really important kind of piece of working in the restoration field or any field that is evolving really rapidly. So I will leave you with this lovely slide and I will take any questions. Thanks.